What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and I wanted to talk about, I guess with Action Comics number 1000 coming out, I want to talk about why DC decided to kill Superman. And, I don't really expect this to be like a hugely popular video, not at all. I mean, honestly, the death of Superman's kind of been beat to death, but it is one of my favorite topics to discuss, which we've talked about this before to a degree, not in this capacity, not as like a complete thing, but of course, the death of Superman happened in 1992, and it was interesting when it took place. That was just before I started reading Marvel Comics, and so even then, like even when I started reading, I still wasn't really into DC. So, but I knew about it. I mean, I knew about Superman dying, and I knew that it was a big to do. It was a pretty huge thing. I mean, it made like national news when DC killed Superman, which is exactly what they were shooting for. They were shooting for the idea that they would receive national attention, that all eyes would be drawn to the Man of Steel. A lot of people sort of look at the death of Superman and they look at Batman Nightfall as kind of like the death knell of the comic book industry, basically saying like, there were so many variant covers that were released and all that kind of stuff that's what led to the near collapse, the big comic bust of the 1990s. But one of the things that kind of gets thrown out there when people talk about the day that Superman died, or the decision to kill him, is they say, well, it all really just came down to the fact that, Warner Brothers had Superman, the Adventures of Lois and Clark, and then, Jerry Ordway said, well, let's just kill Superman, and then that's that, and then the rest is history. To a degree, it's a little more complicated than that. I mean, to a degree, that's true, but it is a little more complicated. The death of Superman, I would say, was probably about 20 years in the making. I mean, it had been coming for a long time. So jumping back to like 1971, Mort Weisinger had retired, and the retirement of Mort Weisinger was, well, it was almost like the nail in the coffin for Superman's comics, because Mort Weisinger had the most significant hand in the development of Superman outside of Kurt Swan, who drew him for 30 years. Mort Weisinger's involvement in the Superman landscape was immense. He took over in like the mid 1950s to late 1950s, somewhere between 1956 and 1959, I think it was. That was all done by Julius Schwartz, who had basically introduced Barry Allen and then orchestrated the blending of science fiction with superhero stories. And then what you had Weisinger, who said, well, in order to make Superman succeed, in order to make him into something greater than just a comic book character, we have to make him like a household name. I mean, he was to a degree by then. I mean, he was really, really popular just among readership, and even just with like the general public. But just because a superhero is really, really popular in comics and kind of, goes into pop culture, doesn't mean they're going to stay that way forever. And that was the goal, was to turn Superman into like this massive, larger than life concept. And so Mort Weisinger's idea was add something new every 6 months. Every 6 months, I don't care what it is, introduce something new. And so, you had guys like Otto Bender, who gave us like Supergirl, and they had all these crazy things that were thrown in, but it worked. It worked by a huge margin. Every 6 months, fans had something new. And so because of that, a lot of the DC comics at the time that were coming out, the Flash comics, the Green Lantern comics, different things like that, they weren't as successful as they could be because Superman was literally off in space doing things. And if you were reading stories about Superman being in space, why would you read stories about Green Lantern? And Superman was incredibly fast, and he was racing the Flash and different things like that. And if Superman was so fast that he could basically reach everybody just in the nick of time, then what reason did you have to read the Flash? It was different things like that. He was a fighter. He always, fought against the bad guys. So there was really no need to read Wonder Woman. Of course, those different comics did have their fan bases, and of course they were getting readership, hence the reason they weren't canceled. But the fact remains here that when it came to him as a character, Mort Weisinger just blew up the Superman mythos. And so in 1971, when he retired, the question that everybody had was, well, then what comes next? Who can possibly follow this whole thing of Mort Weisinger? Who can keep this ship sailing? And so Julius Schwartz had stepped in. And again, Julius Schwartz was the person that had kind of orchestrated the Silver Age of comics. And so it made sense that he would be the one to step in. For those of you guys who aren't familiar with Julius Schwartz, he is like the 1950s equivalent of Jeff Johns in the modern day. In terms of personality, I don't really know. I don't know much about Julius Schwartz outside from the different stories that like Neil Adams would tell me whenever I would go to cons. But aside from that, like he was the guy that orchestrated this huge paradigm shift in DC. And so when Mort Weisinger retired, Julius Schwartz stepped in and said, well, then I'll take care of Superman. The problem with Mort Weisinger's idea of Superman is that he believed he'd become too powerful. And in all honesty, that's what fans liked about Superman. He was basically indestructible. And that was really the challenge. That's what made the story so good by Mort Weisinger and the various writers who were working for him, was that with Superman's stories pushing him further and further beyond into the realm of just, lunacy for the most part, because there were things like super glasses, and because he could fly backwards in time, and because, he was able to outrace infinity. take that for what it's worth. Because he was able to do all these crazy things, the concept became, well, now it has to be bigger this time. Now it has to be bigger this time. And then it got bigger and bigger and larger. And it got to the point where the stories were so crazy and fantastic. But Silver Age Superman is sort of this embodiment of like how zany comics were back then, pulling a chain of planets out of a dying galaxy, different things like that. And so because of that, Mort Weisinger said, well, if we're going to make Superman interesting, we have to make him relatable. He did the exact opposite of what Mort Weisinger had done. He basically had Dennis O'Neil go through and, like, I think it was with Superman issue number 233. I'm pretty sure it's issue number 233. They started a story that ran for like 3 parts. And it was basically Superman fighting a version of himself that was made of sand. And so what this did is it ended with a story, but basically with this sand version of Superman defeated, his powers were cut in half. He was half as strong as he was before. Kryptonite was totally rendered inert. So you basically had Superman who was half as strong as he was before with no real weaknesses outside of magic. And fans hated it. Oh, they despised it. And they despised it so much. 4 years later, DC set it all back. They said, okay. But that's the nature of comics, right? The nature of comics is you don't know what works until you change what works. That's the only way to really know. The only way to really know that Mort Weisinger, his style of, editorial control and his style of having different people write different ways, no one could really know that worked until you changed that, because it was Superman. While he did increase the popularity under Mort Weisinger, you didn't know if it was just the natural progression of Superman because of exposure, because comics were regaining popularity as a result of them being blended with science fiction, because he was the first superhero. He's the one that set the whole superhero genre in motion, or if it was because of what Mort Weisinger did. And that's what we learned. Weisinger was the one who had basically made Superman popular throughout the 1950s and the 1960s by just telling these crazy stories, or at least making him more popular than he was. And so with Julius Schwartz basically going through and saying, okay, fine, we'll set things back to the way they were before, the damage had been done. There was really no way to come back from that. And the reason for that was because of Jerry Conway. So Jerry Conway wrote a story in 1971 called The Night Gwen Stacy Died. And this story changed it really like shifted comics in a new direction, because never before had there ever been an instance when a main superhero had failed so disastrously that their love interest died. That didn't happen. That never happened. Their friends might die, a sidekick might die, even another superhero might die. But like the love interest, that never happened. That never took place. And it was mind-blowing when that happened. Not only that, the potential existed within the confines of the story that not only did Gwen Stacy die, but it was possibly Spider-Man who actually killed her. And so it was nuts when that story came out. And people were just like, wow. I mean, in truth, like the comic book community was ready for a new direction. The stories had been zany and fantastic and science fiction-y and different things like that. And that was cool, but it had been that way for about a decade and a half. People were ready for something else. They were ready for like a new direction of comic books. And Jerry Conway gave them that with the story of The Night Gwen Stacy Died. The funny thing about this, though, was that at the same time Gwen Stacy died, Batman was struggling for the most part, and that's really what this thing comes down to, is Batman basically regaining popularity, Gwen Stacy dying, and the Julius Schwartz decision on Superman. Batman was kind of an afterthought. I mean, in this three-part discussion that we're talking about, we can really view Batman as kind of like a background character. He was just there. He was just a person who was there, and there were stories about him, but he wasn't very popular at all. He had a little bit of popularity in the 1960s because of the Adam West show, which helped to kind of like drive new readership to the Batman comics. But once the show went off the air, like the sales of the comics tanked again because nobody had a reason to buy him. And so with that whole thing, reaching its fruition in 1985, what this meant was that Superman was continually going down in popularity, and then Batman was stagnant. He was just kind of sitting there. He was going down a little bit, but not nearly as bad as Superman. And so what happened is in 1985, DC grabbed Frank Miller, and they brought him over from Daredevil, and they said, basically give us a new story of Batman. And Frank Miller wrote The Dark Knight Returns, where Batman was older, and he was grizzled, and he was far more cynical. He'd retire, the Joker returned, Gotham was overridden by mobs, or by, different criminal groups and things like that. It was like the worst case scenario for what would happen if Batman just quit one day. And so what ended up happening is in The Dark Knight Returns, that story had all these incredibly and amazing themes that helped to kind of revitalize interest in the character of Bruce Wayne and the role that Batman played. But what really popped it all off and what really set it all off was Batman beating Superman. That never happened. They were always friends. They always teamed up. They always had adventures together. That was the nature of their characters. Batman defeating Superman was massive when it happened because it was believed to be something that Batman just wasn't able to do. It wasn't a part of his wheelhouse. No way he would have been able to pull that off. And so from there, it was just a matter of watching Batman's popularity just begin to just skyrocket. I mean, it was almost just like, it just took off. Dark Knight Returns was followed by Batman Year One. And with that, like, Batman overtook Superman, because now what you had is you had a guy that people could look to and say, well, he's not just a crazy guy dressed as a bat, he's a crazy guy dressed as a bat who beat Superman. And so people were just like, damn. So now they had like a huge interest in Batman where they didn't really have it before. And once new people started getting it, once new readership started flowing into the Batman comics, then people began to realize he's a lot more relatable than Superman. I mean, sure, the only thing that really separates Batman from them is like his extreme wealth and his extreme intelligence. With enough time, anybody could physically become as capable as Batman is. With enough time, they could learn the martial arts that Batman does. That's how the viewership looked at him. They didn't have the money or the resources he had, but they certainly had like the same physical body with the same physical limitations. Batman wasn't superhuman. He had to eat, he had to sleep, he had to drink water. He had all the same limitations they did. And so they could see themselves becoming Batman. And so in that moment, what it did is it kind of threw Superman into the background. Superman just kind of became a character who was there and had stories. But DC's perspective, their viewpoint at the time, was that Superman has to be number one. He's Superman. He's the first superhero. If he's the first superhero, he's been everything to everybody all these years, then there's no reason why Superman shouldn't be the highest selling publication. And so at that time, because of the fact that Warner Brothers had commissioned for the release of Superman, The Adventures of Lois and Clark, that story was hugely popular, because it combined, drama and intrigue and, whodunit mystery and all those different things, along with Dean Cain just looking actually pretty cool as Superman. And so what DC wanted to do, their whole philosophy was, okay, since like 1938, Superman and Lois Lane have been beating around the bush. We know they're going to get together, but they've just kind of been doing the dance, and so on and so forth. So let's just do that. Like, let's just have them get married. Like, let's just have Superman and Lois Lane get married. That'll be the big thing that'll draw interest back into the Superman comics, because finally it's the wedding of a lifetime. Superman and Lois Lane get married. The issue with this was that the Superman, Lois and Clark show was already going to do that. It was already scripted, it was already planned, all that work had already been put in. And it wouldn't make any sense to go through and change all those wheels, to stop all those wheels from moving, when it was a lot easier to stop the wheels from moving in comics. And so the decision was made, do not have Superman and Lois Lane get married in DC Comics. Do something else. And that's when the story comes in of Jerry Ordway saying, well, then let's just kill him. And so DC said, okay, fine, let's kill Superman. And so they ended up killing off the Man of Steel. The downside of this, and in fact, Max Landis had a really, really cool video about this. I think it's The Death and Return of Superman is what it's called. And he's 100% right when he says that what happened was that after the death of Superman, the sales of Action Comics tanked, the sales of Superman's comics tanked, and never came back. They never quite recovered to where they were before he died in 1992. And the reason why was because people thought they were part of something momentous. They thought they were part of something huge. The death of Superman, like, my God, the death of the first superhero. When a superhero died in comic books, they stayed dead. They never came back. They stayed dead forever. That's the way it was. Bucky Barnes died, or at least was believed to have died, at the end of the original Captain America comics, in what was it, 1940s or 50s or something along those lines? And that was the end of that. Bucky Barnes was never going to be seen or heard from again. Uncle Ben died in what is it, Spider-Man #1, I think it was, or maybe Amazing Fantasy #15, whichever one it was. Uncle Ben died, and he was never going to come back. He was going to be gone forever. When superheroes died, when important characters, I should say, in comic books died, they stayed dead. And so to everybody who looked, everybody who went out and bought Action Comics, Action Comics number 75, I think it was. Everybody who went out or maybe it was Superman 75, whichever one it was, everybody who went out and bought The Death of Superman, the comic where he died, did not believe he was ever going to make his return. And then he did. And then he showed back up 6 months to a year later or something along those lines. And fans felt betrayed. They felt cheated. They felt like the rug had been pulled out from under them, like it was a bait and switch. And that put people in a pretty sour tone. A lot of people felt duped and tricked. It led to the collapse of the comic book industry. But I don't know. I mean, it is kind of interesting. Like when you get into the meat and potatoes of why DC killed Superman, it's a lot more complex than the idea of, well, Jerry Ordway suggested it, so they did it. It wasn't like at the end of the day, it was a napkin idea, but the fact remains, it had been building up to that point. It was something that had been, whether DC intended it or not, it was something that had been progressing in that direction for a long, long time. But anyway, just wanted to go ahead and throw that out there. Figured you guys might enjoy this. Thought it might be kind of a cool video to celebrate Action Comics number 1000 coming out here in the next couple days. If you guys are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.